Hey there. Welcome to another presentation. This is the second presentation I'll be giving at WaffleCon 6. This one, I believe, is going to be online, so it may be recorded and posted elsewhere, but I'm going to be making this recording just so that we have it online on my own channel in case. So today we're going to be discussing cutting corners while staying sharp. These are some solo development tips and tricks that I've figured out on my own. We're basically going to be covering ways that I have made nice looking things that are good enough in games and expanded my portfolio and helped me stay pretty prolific. This is a sister talk to the one I will, I guess, in context be giving yesterday. It's the most previous video I've uploaded to the channel, which is the aggregate and holistic prototype development. And both of these revolve around the talk I gave at GDC, which centers around this idea of backwards feeling design. So all three of these discussions sort of overlap in different ways. In this one, we're going to be discussing some specific ways that I sort of isolate ideas and build stuff from those. So we're discussing, isolating the elements of your designs that matter and how to get those points across, right? You don't always need to go the full 9 yards with everything. You can make stuff good enough, and that can be part of your game. There's going to be lots of examples. We're going to go through them. And we'll also, just like the last talk, be keeping things fairly abstract. But if there's any questions about how systems and this work specifically, or you have any ideas that you want to pursue, feel free to reach out. And contact info will be at the end. So you kind of have to find your point, right? Like when you're working on a feature, that can be the art of the game or a mechanic or an animation or whatever it is. You have to find the point of it, right? What are you trying to focus on? On the right, the point is, the first one in Relighter, that game is all about relighting the environment. So making just very obvious light sources and how they connect together, right? Then we're also going to try and focus on things. Like, what's the integral aspect of the thing you're working on? When you play through it in your head, what aspects are there? What are you trying to teach the player? So in Illyrium, there's a good example here of this puzzle where you have to use one colored ball to make things do different actions, right? Solving the puzzle incorrectly it's a big facet of that game, so focus on that, right? Do that in a simple way, direct way that you can explain to the player. What does good enough mean, right? How can we portray the point as effectively as possible? Is the focus clear enough to be understood by playtesters if you give them the game? And then, of course, there are constraints. As solo developers, it's going to be very hard to make cohesive experiences which meet the first two criterion, right? So you have to think, what is the main thing that I'm trying to show the playtester? Or what am I trying to put in the game, specifically? Outside of the context of prototyping, what am I actually trying to build? What is this feature? What is the focus of that feature? And then what are the constraints stopping me from just making this super big expansive thing? And how do I get around them? So this first example, this is a game that I made in 2019. It was featured in the RPI Game Fest of that year, and I believe it won Best in Game Feel, which I was really proud of. And it's got this really unique feature that I hadn't seen a lot at the time. It's kind of this ape out or door kickers kind of thing where you can't see around corners. And I didn't know of any games at the time that did this, so I was pretty happy with this unique little mechanic. But I had a lot of trouble because I was a starting out developer and I was making this in Game Maker and I wasn't great at programming and I couldn't do any 2D art. So the point of this is that you can't see everything. That's cool, but how do I portray that? I tried a lot of different methods using 2D art to do that, and none of them were successful. So I tried to focus more on okay, instead of the art facet of this, what does it actually do? It's working on player perception. It's stopping the player from perceiving their environment, effectively making the perception of the character way more interesting, right? That changes your position in the environment changes your spatial information, and combat is changed as that. So the constraints of this are that I'm not a 2D artist. Right, I can't make all of these bespoke environments or these bespoke environments with all of these nice fading graphics and all of these different pieces which change and interchange, and it also needs to be widely applicable to the entire game. So the point is that you can't see everything. Focus on player perception and do it without using 2D art, because at the time I could not make 2D art. So how do you make it good enough? So inefficient line of sight code, that's fine. on the top right, you can see all the triangles that get drawn. It's fine. There's a lot of overdraw, but it's okay. You can, then start experimenting with breakable walls. So then there's the second GIF there, where the walls break and your perception changes. Cool. Now let's change the color of the space and hide secrets everywhere. Great. Awesome. That's good enough. That's okay. So, like, in this case, this is the only example I have where I go beyond good enough, right? And that's kind of why I brought this game up. But at the at the beginning of 2022, I revisited this game, and I made a prototype with extensive 2D art, a lot of lighting, a lot of rendering. I sort of envisioned all of this stuff previously, like all of this very glowy, different neon-y kind of elements where you turn around a corner and you see like, whoa, that thing's glowing, or like I can see, some kind of transitionary space where the lighting is completely different. And you also have all of these little weenies around you. Like there's that white space at the top of the bottom left GIF, or bottom right GIF at the very beginning, and there's red enemies that blend in and make it very funky, and these physics objects and all this stuff that's going on that kind of brings this environment alive. But unfortunately, when I was making the game, I just wanted to build it and be done with it and move on. So I said, I am not going to make 2D art, but I am going to try my best to build these basic, quote-unquote developer graphics and center the game around that. And just kind of make these really small, fine things which accomplish what I'm trying to do in a way that is fun and interesting. So here's another example. I've got a few examples that we're going to go through as well. So when I was working on Rockhopper, which was a game that I had made for Project Studio at my time at NYU, I had made a bunch of levels, and I made a bunch of mechanics, enemies, environments, and all that stuff. And the problem is that they had no textures or color at all. And I had thought maybe just doing vertex shading, because that's what I did on my previous project, Mindroid, which is just adding colored materials to objects and then not really doing anything else. But I didn't really want to do that this time. I wanted to give more placeness to the world. I felt like it needed more, world building and specifically indirect narrative. Like, what is this environment and what is in it? Then I had a few constraints. I had 2 weeks to make art for the whole game. It was a long game. It had more than 10 levels and 8 enemies, and they all needed texturing, or so I thought. Point is to add a sense of placeness to the world, so focus on the indirect narrative, and add a low detail and widely applicable way. So you have a screenshot on the right, but if we keep going, we can see like some more screenshots here too. So the simplest path is to just not do textures, just shade them and write shaders and experiment with shader libraries. You can find a lot of them. There's the free Unity Toon shader, but then if you want to spend money, there's also the FlatKit Unity shaders. And that means that you can also just build simple shapes and use those simple shapes, right? So I built everything in ProBuilder, and I put it in Unity. And then I grabbed a shader, and then I threw it in Unity. There's no textures on any of these objects. I just was able to write Toon shaders and experiment with Toon shaders and build these graphics which look good enough, right? They get the point across. And because there's no artwork and everything is procedural, then I can start toying with it all within Unity and controlling it all within Unity. So on the top right, you can see my first experiment where I had these different types of Toon shaded objects, and then you can see how I applied those to like a more stylized rock. And then using that stylization, I was able to build these sort of ruins and these old environments. And then this big photo is the first time that I looked at something and was like, oh yeah, that's got context. That is a place. There's a moss growing on the surfaces which are facing up, right? The giant arm, which is grabbing onto that pylon sticking out of the wall, has rusted. And by using the shaders available, that rim outline on it is white, signifying that it doesn't belong here. Right, it's something else. You can tell as well that some objects have kind of fallen into place, like that giant pillar on the left. And it's got a lot of context, but not a lot of detail, which I think is good. This was another variant I did, where I simply changed the color of the walls and added a few textures and modified the color palette just a bit, but it wasn't too much. I added water, which is another thing, and some particles. But one thing that I liked about this was that the greenery just immediately worked, came along very nicely, super comfortable, and I was really happy with it. And greenery is really hard to get right in 3D. This was the first level that I tested with texturing. This is the area that the player started in, or I guess this is the area that the player starts in. I think I modified it specifically in the final version, but you've got the vines hanging off of the walls. You've got rocks scattered about. You've got these dropped giant pillars everywhere and some arms, which make you think like, whoa, what is going on here? Like, and none of this is too hard. These are all very simple shapes, very simply shaded, but they get the point across. They're good enough. That's the main point. It's another environment that I did. This was in the final game. And then this was the one I was most proud of, which is this 3-layered environment with jump pads that you explore and run around. And as you get higher and higher, you can kind of see the distinction. In the final version of this, the top layer is a lot darker. So you have like that top donut-shaped ring, and then you have the second layer, and then the bottom. And the top one in the final thing is, I think, like a dark gray, because I wanted it to get darker as you got higher up. But then you've also got this moss on all the stuff, which kind of signifies like, oh, this area is very old. And these vines that are lower down, they're more brown because there's less sun down here. And there's all these little details you can do. This game wasn't small. This game was big. It was a lot of areas and a lot of different types of environments, and I'm very proud of myself for executing on all of them. But I did it all with these very small tools. So we're going to talk about the next thing. Animation is something that takes a long time to get right, and even a good enough set of animations can take a very long time to make. So what's the point of this? I wanted to add more polish to Godwalker, my thesis. I felt like animations were a huge part of the game feel. The constraint was that I didn't have all this time to make all these different guns and enemies and all this stuff animated. So I had to figure out a way to work fast. So the point is to polish the game. So focus on pertinent and common animations in an effective and reusable way. And on the right, you have this example of a spider crab, which we'll get into in a moment. How do you make this good enough? Well, I decided that there were 3 major elements of this game which needed to be made, right? There was the player, who needed to have this sort of composite rig. By composite, I mean there are basic like standard animations that I either made or got from a place like Mixamo, and then I took those, and instead of making a giant tree, I mapped the player's input on the left stick to each of the different run directions. So if you run forward, it plays the forward animation, and forward left plays a combination of the forward and left animations, and or whatever, and it blends between those as you go. And then I created an IK handler specifically for the arms and the weapon. Then I used some of that code to create an enemy animator, which moves the rigs of an enemy around. We'll kind of look at a little bit more in that in depth. We'll look at all of these, I believe, in a little more in depth. But then there's the procedural weapon animator, which allows weapons in the game just to be animated using a few simple variables. So the composite player animator functions as I was talking about. This video is just a larger representation of that. So you can swap between weapons. This is a very unrefined early version, so excuse the weird thing going on, but you can see that there's like run forward, run left, run right, run backward, and there's combinations of the 2 animations blended, which results in this really nice and smooth custom animation controller, right? It's like simulated, it's physically based kind of. There's IK running on that too, with the player's torso, arms, head, and I believe their hands controlled by a separate weapon manager. So you have this balance between things that are procedural and things that are baked, which is why it's called composite. So we've got our procedural enemy animator. There are no animations on the enemy at all. This looks really complex, but basically there's just 4 feet which move around and tell these legs sort of where to stand. The head of the enemy is animated, or I guess, programmed to look at the player and rotate towards the player, which then controls the quote-unquote body of the enemy. And when they get hit, they have this recoil that makes their whole body sort of fling to the side. But I couldn't capture a good GIF of that, so you'll just have to trust me. Then here's another example of just the versatility of these guys. I made them dance for a previous midterm presentation that I had. And we're going to talk about the procedural weapon animations. So I've got 3 to show. The first one is the plasma rifle, which uses a set of variables beneath, which you can see. But by doing this, we're basically saying how much does this weapon kick on the Y and Z positions? How much does this weapon rotate with recoil? And how much does the body recoil? So in this case, the player's body is rotating back slightly, which moves the whole weapon back. Then the weapon is kicking upwards a little bit and back a little bit. So you're getting a little bit of bodily rotation, as if this weapon is being held by the player, which adds a lot to the feel. And then you're getting it kicking up and back just a little bit. There's another example of a different kind of weapon. So this is the auto pistol, which is very small and very fast firing. So you can see that the weapon itself is rotating instead of just the body, but the body's also rotating. So you kind of get this disconnected feel between the weapon and the body, which kind of stands out in this like little kicks. So now you have just a little bit up, or a little bit down actually, now that I think about it, and a little bit back. So it's just barely kicking itself around, which you can kind of tell, and it's returning very quickly to its original position too. So you have this really nice little combination of elements. Our final one is the carbine, which doesn't have any Y kick. It only has Z kick and bodily rotation. So you get this very small but long kick back, which makes this feel more like an assault rifle, I think. I've experimented without the body rotation on this, and it just kind of feels weird. I use that more on the minigun, if anyone's familiar. But yeah, that's how that works. It basically kicks to these positions and then lerps it back at a certain rate, depending on the weapon and the fire rate and all that good stuff. So we're going to talk about, I believe this is the last example, but we're going to talk about the combat manager that I worked on, which was a thing that I built because I wanted to put more game in my game, but I didn't have time to make a bunch of combat encounters, right? I needed a way to make a lot of levels because it's a roguelike, and I needed a way to drop a bunch of enemies into those levels so that I could more comfortably build out the game. So I focused on putting more game in that game, or, making more generative random combat encounters. Yeah, I just didn't have the time to add more waves of enemies. So here's a nice GIF of that combat manager working in real time. So put more game in the game, focus on generative combat encounters rather than bespoke combat encounters, and the easiest, quickest possible path to implementation. Just do it fast, basically. It's a very low quality GIF for, just because we need to have low quality GIFs in every presentation. But you can see as the player moves around the map, there are all these different variables triggering different pieces. And the core idea here is that when I designed a level, I thought to myself, like, why am I putting these enemies in the places that I am? Like, what's the logic of me doing these designs? Why are the strong enemies in the center? Why are the flying enemies in between platforms? All these different things that I was thinking about. Then I created a set of rules for those enemies to be spawned. Then I turned those rules into a script. So that's what the combat manager does. It looks at these environments and it says, okay, we have this 5-dimensional array of possible waves and encounters. Then we're going to take those and we're going to create an encounter out of those. We're going to look at each enemy and say, what kind of spot does this enemy want to be in? We have a lot of different types of spawn point requirements, right? Do we want it to be close to the player? Do we want it to be far away from the player? Does it have to be in the center of the arena? Does it have to be in the air, right? All these things that I was accounting for when I was creating bespoke combat encounters, which now can just be accounted for by the game. The result of that, another low quality GIF, is that I can make an environment, which takes long time. It takes a really long time. And then I can simply drop in the spawn points, and then the game takes care of the rest. I've already written out what encounters are possible. So those encounters then have the data of the enemies and where they want to spawn and how they want to spawn on them. So then I could just say, okay, Here are your spawn points. Here's the logic behind them, and then it's done, and it works, and it runs. And that's all I've got. Those are a few little tips that I've had about solo development, thinking about that, and walking you guys through the process of how I go about making things alone. Just thinking about the constraints, thinking about the requirements of them. Like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? I have to edit this slide. There is a special thanks to Zach Anderson in this talk as well. That's from the previous talk. Zach helped out with some of the player controller stuff on the Aether prototype remake. But I forgot to put that in, actually, and I was going to ask him if he wanted that. But now, guess what, Zach? You also get a special thanks in this talk, too. So, good for you. But yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Discord. You can email me. Or just drop a comment. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one.